Was the timer running?
He said last time there was a timer.
So it didn't work.
I don't know. I just pushed the red button. I did it this time, so I don't want to make it trouble. The first reading this morning was from one of the books that's Catholic but not Protestant. That's one of the books. That is the last book written probably in the Old Testament. There is even one scholar who thinks that book might have been written after Jesus was born. And the thing about it is it talks about heaven and hell, the devil, how man must be immortal. It's very clear. All those teachings that we hold are definitely in that book, the Book of Wisdom. That's the book, Only the Good Die Young. Heard that expression? Yeah. That's the book that, because it's interesting. I'll wait for Kevin before we get started. See, once they start to believe in heaven and hell, and that God rewards you after this life, believing that God rewards you in this life falls away. So the old teaching was, if you're suffering here, you must be bad. And that's why the reading today was, if you're suffering here, it may be God testing you for the next world. So only the good die young. If you died young, in the old teaching, you must have done something really bad, or your parents must have done something really bad. But when the Book of Wisdom is written, it's only the good die young because God, you die young because He's saving you from being corrupted in the future. So He's doing you a favor by having you die young. Completely turns the old teaching on its head. So being childless in the Old Testament was considered a scandal. You must be being punished, right? But in the Book of Wisdom, it talks about the woman who is childless, or the man who can't have children in his marriage, is not a bad person. It's how you live your life, not whether you're childless or not. So all the old teachings, the Book of Wisdom flips on its head because they no longer believe that you're rewarded and punished on this earth. So if you're poor or you're sick or you're childless, no longer considered a curse as it was in the Old Testament. Kevin is going to come, right? Does anybody know? Did he say anything, anybody?
Well, he usually goes home.
He goes home. We got a few more minutes. Here he is. Okay. Let's go ahead and start with a prayer. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Again, Heavenly Father, we come before you this morning, asking you to open our minds and our hearts to better understand your word, because we really want your word to lead our lives, so our lives may be productive and bring glory to you, and bring others to understand and believe in you, so that their lives may be enriched. So we ask you to bless us all through Christ our Lord. Amen. So last week, I apologize, I meant to bring the Gilgamesh epic version of the flood, so that you could hear really what it sounds like. Again, the theory is that a lot of the stories in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, not the rest of the chapter, but the first 11 chapters, a number of the stories have counterparts in ancient Near Eastern mythology, and it's a very strong possibility that the Hebrew author may have used a previous story as a kind of a template, right? And written the story in the Bible, but they make major changes in the story. We already saw this with the Babylonian creation story. Takes place during this great battle, and everything's chaotic and messy. But the creation story of 6 days is very calm and peaceful, harmonious, and a whole different way of looking at the world. Even though they use the same kind of structure, the 6-day structure, a whole different way of looking at the world. Man, instead of being a slave to the gods in the Babylonian story, man is seen as kind of God's manager on earth in the biblical story. So man got an elevated status. So remember, this doesn't mean this, if the story is copied from somewhere else and changed, that doesn't mean it's not inspired, right? The inspired part would be actually the part that is changed. Correct? All right, so same thing, there are at least 3 flood stories besides the one in the Bible that are common in the ancient reading. And the oldest one is this one. It's the Gilgamesh epic. Gilgamesh epic is probably the oldest written story in the world, literally. Goes back to 2900 BC. We don't know who wrote it, but that's because we actually don't know who wrote any of the stories in the ancient world. There's nothing weird about that, right? Several copies of this have been found around. Again, I think I explained this last week, but the Gilgamesh epic is all about a man, a king, Gilgamesh, who was the king of a city named Ur, which is a real city, looking for the secret of immortality. A friend of his dies in battle. He comes to realize, hey, we're all going to die. Why aren't we immortal? So he goes on a search for literally the fountain of youth in a sense. He runs across this guy who does have immortality, and the guy happens to be somebody who survived a flood with in a boat with a bunch of animals. Sound familiar? Right? So this may be the template for the Noah's Ark story. I say maybe because there are other stories as well. So we know that floods happen in that part of the world. We know that flooding causes people to ask, like, look at what just happened in Puerto Rico, right? Why? Natural disasters, people want to know why. Why do some people suffer that way more than others? In the biblical story, generally the idea was that the people must have done something wrong. Now, that's changed in our teaching today. Everybody understand? After the book of Job was written, that teaching started to change quite a bit. So anyway, let me read this to you so you can see the motivation for the flood is quite different here than it is in the Bible. You know the city Shirupok, it stands on the bank of the Euphrates. Everybody knows the Euphrates River, right? The city grew old, and the gods that were in it were old. There was Anu, the lord of the firmament, their father and warrior, Enlil, their counselor, and Nurtu, the helper, and Uji, the watcher over the canals, and with them also Ea. In those days the world teemed with people, multiplied, the world bellowed like a wild bull, and the great God was aroused by the clamor. Enlil heard the clamor and said to the gods in council, the uproar of mankind is intolerable, and sleep is no longer possible by reason of the babel. So the gods agreed to exterminate mankind. So in this story, the reason why the flood comes is people are too noisy, gods can't sleep, let's kill them all off, right? Quite a different motivation than you find in the biblical story where God decides people are bad, right? Now, there is a guy who's saved. Now, in the biblical story, Noah is saved because he is good. In this story, the guy is saved because there's a particular God that owes this guy a favor. So he warns him about the flood because he owes him a favor. It has nothing to do with whether the guy's good or not. Everybody understand? That's not even part of the story. So the gods agreed to exterminate mankind. Enlil did this, but Ea, who's another god, because of his oath, warned me in a dream. So in this story is being told in first person by the guy who is the Noah figure. In the Bible, it's told in third person, basically, right? Second and third. He whispered these words to my house of reeds. Reed house, wall o wall, hearken reed house, and reflect. O man of Shirupok, son of Ubaru Tutu, tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon your possessions, look for life, despise worldly good, save your soul alive. Tear down your house, I say, and build a boat. These are the measurements of the boat. You will build her, let her beam equal her length. So this is a boat that's basically round, in a sense. Let her deck be roofed like the vault that covers the abyss. Remember the Noah story? It's decked and then there's a vault over keep the rain from, and take into the boat the seed of all living creatures. So this person is told to build a boat, take all animals on board. When I understood, I said to my Lord, behold, what you've commanded I will honor and perform. But how shall I answer the people in the city of the elders? So people are going to be asking me, why are you building this big boat, right? So the God in the story tells the guy to lie. So then Ea opened his mouth and said to me, tell them this. I have learned that Enlil, that is the main God, is wrathful against me. I dare no longer walk on his land or live in his city. I will go down to the Gulf to dwell with Ea, my Lord. But on you he will rain down abundance, rare fish, shy wildfowl, a rich harvest tide in the evening. The rider of the storm will bring you wheat in torrents. So basically, he's told to tell the people, this God is mad at me. I have to move down to the Gulf to be under the protection of this other God. You guys stay here because all kinds of good things are going to happen to you. And of course, what happens is the flood comes and kills everybody. The story is very similar, but you can see the huge difference in the motivation. Everybody makes sense? So it's, again, here you have a story. And again, even though these are myths, they're told in a mythological form, there's definitely some concrete, historic happening behind these stories. We know for a fact, archaeological evidence, flooding is a problem. Is it possible a guy survived a flood on a boat with a bunch of animals? Sure, right? Does this make sense to everybody? But then the story takes on a life of its own, because what they're really trying to do is explain, why does evil happen? Why do bad things happen in nature? Does this make sense? It's written to answer a much bigger question. And this is the thing about, we're going to finish up today with the Tower of Babel. So the thing that I want you to see here is that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are really what we would call prehistory. What happened before we know what happened? Right? Nobody knows. So here are the questions. Why is the world the way it is? Why do we think things should be better, but they're not? Why do we seem to have a special place in creation? Why do we have a sense that maybe the animals, we should be able to get along with them better, but we don't? Right? Think about, these are all questions. Why do bad things happen in nature and people get killed? All these, really, these are deep philosophical questions that the first 11 chapters of stories are trying to answer before you get into the actual historical part of the Bible, which is Abraham. You get in Abraham, you're definitely going to get into history, right? So these are stories that were put together to basically try to answer, why are things the way they are, without us actually knowing what happened. That's why they're written in mythological form. Everything's symbolic. Everybody with me? Again, doesn't mean they're not inspired, because it's telling us, what are we supposed to believe? We're supposed to believe that God created the world. They created the world to be good. He gave man a special place, that we should have a good relationship with God and with the earth and with the animals, that because of free will, evil comes into the world. And the main problem is, once evil comes into the world, what happens? It multiplies, and we are now overwhelmed by evil. So each story makes its own point, but the series, right, is making another point, and that is, evil just compounds and compounds until you get to the last story, which is we can't even talk to each other because we don't speak the same language anymore. Instead of being able to repair relationships, now we can't even talk. So in the last story, which is politically incorrect, hey, that's the way life goes, right? Multiple languages must be a bad thing because we can't communicate. So since we can't communicate, multiple languages must be a punishment for something that people did. Does this make sense to everybody? Based on the whole sequence, right? Now, I'm not speaking out against diversity or multiple languages, but in their mind, you can see that is, everything has a positive and a negative side, right? They're looking at the negative side here. If we all came from the same parents, why don't we all speak the same language? So you gotta explain why that is, right? The Noah's Ark story is in there. It explains why bad, it also explains why don't people live as long as they used to? Because now God has limited our days. Why can we can now eat meat? Because God gives us meat to eat after the Noah's Ark story, right? The Noah's Ark story kind of ties up a lot of loose ends left by the previous stories. Doesn't tie up all the loose ends, but some of the loose ends. Everybody with me? So let's look at chapter, let's open, chapter 9 is where the Noah's Ark story is. Notice chapter 10 then is called the Table of Nations, which is another way of saying a genealogy. The stories in Genesis 1 through 11, some of them don't have a natural connection. Cain and Abel obviously have a natural connection to Adam and Eve, right? Because they're the sons. If you get from Cain and Abel to Noah's Ark, there's a whole chapter that's a genealogy. It's just, this guy had this guy, this guy had this guy, let's just get to the next story, right? How do you get from the Noah's Ark story to the Tower of Babel story? You throw in another genealogy. So chapter 5 is a genealogy, and chapter 10 is a genealogy. Am I making sense here? It's giving you a transition that keeps the story moving along. Otherwise, you'd just be jumping into the next story with no transition. Well, how do we get here? So whoever the editor was, right, is using the genealogies to transition you to the next story. Don't put too much. People get into these genealogies and they try to find all these secrets. Don't worry too much about the genealogies. There is some symbolism there, but it's not that critical. Okay. Chapter 11. And this is a short story. It's the last one in the sequence. Who's reading? Chapter 11, verse 1. Somebody read it? Go ahead.
The whole world spoke the same language.
Which makes sense because we all came from the same parents. So we should speak the same. We should be able to communicate. Right? Go ahead.
While men were migrating in the east, they came upon a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us mold bricks and harden them with fire." Okay,
so this is the way buildings are built in Mesopotamia. So just to be clear, because we're going to run into this in the future, the pyramids in Egypt are made out of stone. The Egyptians had stone quarries. The Egyptians made the pyramids out of stone. There's not a lot of stone quarries in Mesopotamia, but Mesopotamia has a lot of clay. So they made their buildings out of bricks made out of clay, and of course, you're better off firing the brick. Everybody understands me by firing the brick, because if you don't fire the brick, eventually, out in the elements, it's going to deteriorate quickly. So if you can fire the brick, it'll last a lot longer.
That's around Turkey, isn't it, Mesopotamia?
Yeah, well, no. Mesopotamia is Iran. I'm sorry, Iraq. Turkey is Asia Minor, so Turkey does butt up to it, right? The original Fertile Crescent starts at the Persian Gulf, which is Iraq, right? Curves around the Arabian Desert, the Arabian Peninsula, where it's mostly desert. Curves around into Syria, Lebanon, Syria, and then Israel. Israel really is the bottom of the Fertile Crescent on the west side, and the end of Iraq would be the bottom of the Fertile Crescent on the east side. And what makes it a crescent is there's this huge desert underneath it. If you could move Egypt over a little bit, it would be the bottom of the Fertile Crescent. So you have this break at the Sinai Peninsula, and then you got Egypt with the Nile River, which is very fertile. And those rivers gave birth to the earliest urban civilizations that we know of, earlier than India, or way earlier than India and China. The Egyptians are, you know, they were building pyramids in 2600 BC. That's 800 years before Abraham. Stuff really goes back a long ways there. Earliest writing, earliest cities, again, Jericho, 9000 BC. Earliest empires that we know of are the Sumerian Empire in what would now be Iraq, then the Akkadians, and then also in Iraq is where the Babylonians and the Assyrians were. So all those Mesopotamian empires are now what we call in Iraq. Does that make sense to everybody? Abraham's family originally came from the city of Ur, which is in Iraq, and he has to travel to Israel. But you can't go from Ur to Israel because you'd have to cross the Arabian desert. You can't do it. So Abraham's family goes the whole distance of the Fertile Crescent. It makes sense. You got to travel where there's food available. They settle in northern Syria first in a city called Haran. His father, and then Abraham moves from there down into we'll see that. The thing when you get to the Abraham stories is, if you have a map in front of you, you can put your finger on there's no guessing where was he. You can't do that with any of the earlier stories. Where exactly was the Garden of Eden? You don't know. You know, you don't know. Everything is kind of vague, but that's typical of mythology. Time and space, it's like dreams. We have dreams, right? What's the weird thing about dreams? A lot of times they don't make sense. Our sense of time, your sense of time in a dream is like completely lost, right? Time and space, sometimes you move to places. How'd I go from here to here, right? Sometimes we're underwater, sometimes we're flying. I mean, you know, we have all these weird dreams. So mythology in a lot of ways is a lot like the dream world, trying to figure out really what's going on here. All right, anyway. So the idea that they're going to make a tower out of brick historically fits how they built in Iraq, which is in the Fertile Crescent. So again, there's something tangible behind the story. Go ahead, sorry.
They used bricks for stone and
Bitumen?
bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky, and so make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we shall be scattered all over the earth." Okay,
notice how, spoiler alert, they always give the ending of the story away in the beginning. When you read the story of Moses, it's Pharaoh saying, we got to kill all the boys, otherwise they're going to revolt and leave us. And of course, what happens at the end? They leave. So the biblical authors give away the ending in the beginning. Why would you anticipate that if we don't build a tower, we're going to be scattered all over the earth? That doesn't make sense, right? So they're giving you the ending here. And again, there is, how many people have heard of a ziggurat? Has anybody ever heard the word ziggurat?
Yeah, they would step.
Yeah. So in Egypt, they made pyramids, but they weren't stepped. At least not the later pyramids, they weren't stepped. They were smooth. Yeah. Okay, has anybody ever been to Chichen Itza in Mexico or?
Yes.
So the American Indians built stepped pyramids. Same thing they did in Mesopotamia. A stepped pyramid means it comes up and then there's a level and then it comes up a level. And the reason for building the step pyramids called ziggurats in Babylon is you have flat ground, no mountains. People wanted to elevate their temple. So to elevate the temple, you build a quote-unquote tower or one of these step pyramids. So the Israelites would have seen these when they were brought into exile, and maybe even before that, right? They were pretty famous, and they were made out of fire and mud brick. In fact, the Iraqis actually rebuilt one of these things before the war. I don't know if it's still standing or not, but there are pictures of this thing that had been rebuilt, just like the old ziggurat. So there are ruins of these towers. We know they existed. We know the Israelites probably saw one of these towers. Now think about this. They're brought into exile in Babylon, where it's a different language. Even though it's closely related. The Babylonians spoke Aramaic. Hebrew and Aramaic are like Spanish and Italian maybe, right? Same language family. But nevertheless, it's hard to understand. So here they are. How do we explain the fact that people don't speak the same languages, we can't even get along? Well, let's go back to this story here. Go ahead, keep going.
The Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men had built. Then the Lord said, if now, while they are one people, all speaking the same language, they have started to do this, nothing will later stop them from doing whatever they presume to do. Let us then go down and there confuse their language.
Notice the royal we again. Let us. Go ahead.
So that the one will not understand what another says. Thus the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, or Babel, because there the Lord confused the speech of all the world. It was from that place that he scattered them all over the earth.
Okay, so with this story, you see again, especially in early Old Testament writing, anything bad that happens, God makes it happen. Why does God make it happen? Because people did something bad. So the idea here that the people were being presumptuous, we don't need to get to God to get to the heavens. We can build a tower to get to the heavens. So in some ways, it's like the sin of Eve. The sin of Eve is, I can decide for myself what is right and wrong. I don't have to follow God. Does that make sense? So in this sin kind of recaps that idea, but it's there to explain why can't we speak the same language, because now we're scattered all over. So this again is the last story in the sequence. We generally reread these stories and there's an individual message in each of the stories, right? But we miss the point of the sequence, which is to say that once evil comes into the world, things are so bad, now we can't even talk to one another. Is this making sense, everybody? Because this is going to set up the next story.
I think I missed something there. Why, and I still couldn't figure out by reading it, why did they initially want to build this tower?
You're not really told that completely. It's to get to heaven or to get to the sky or to be like your own God kind of thing.
That's what
It's not real clear. Not real clear, but we're assuming it's like the sin of pride. Right? We can do this on our own. We don't need God. So it's like all these other stories, there's holes in them. The story's only written to explain why you have multiple languages. What exactly they did wrong, we have to assume it's a sin of pride. Does that make sense? Because it's not really clear. But what they have to do is they put this story here because the next story is going to be about Abraham. Now the story of Abraham, God is reversing the process. The process so far is evil comes into the world, things get worse, and what do I mean by things get worse? We can't get along, we can't communicate. How are we ever going to overcome evil? God has to step in to help us. So the call of Abraham is a call to reverse the process that happens in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. But meantime, the Abraham stories are historical. You're no longer reading mythology when you read the Abraham stories. Abraham was a real character. There's no doubt about it. We have a good idea when he lived. We know from the way the stories are written, basically some of the customs of the day kind of let us know when these stories had to have taken place. For instance, Abraham, the famous story where Abraham has sex with his wife's maid. Everybody knows that story, right? That actually was a practice at a certain time in the ancient Near East. So while we look at this and go, wow, how in the heck they do that? Sarah gives the maid to Abraham to have a baby because the custom was if you couldn't get pregnant, if you get your maid pregnant, that became the heir. We look upon this as saying, this is kind of weird, but that's what they did back then. So that enabled us to say he must have lived between this date and this date. Again, we say the date for Abraham is 1850. Some books say 1950, some have 100 years earlier, some have 100 years later. It's kind of bracketed. Don't bet your life savings on 1850. Just around that time. But it's the first real dateable character. Does this make sense?
Yep.
And you know you're not in mythology anymore because now space is going to make sense. You can find all the places on the map, where he goes, what he does, why he does it. It's actually going to make sense. Everybody with you? Whereas when you read the first 11 chapters, there's all these questions. Remember, where does Cain's wife come from? Why does God reject Cain's sacrifice? What was the other problem in that story? That we simply don't know. There's lots of good questions that we have. The story doesn't answer them. So the other thing is the myths are just full of holes. Because they're only trying to symbolically represent certain truths about life. And they leave everything else unanswered. But now now, having said this, the Abraham stories are not all necessarily historically accurate. Some are repeated, which is interesting. Say sometimes you can read the same story more than once. This happens in the Gospels, which is interesting. Everybody knows the famous miracle of the loaves and fishes? Okay, so just a digression. That's the only miracle you can find in all four Gospels written the same way, outside of the resurrection of Jesus. The only miracle Jesus performs in his earthly ministry before he's killed, that's in all four Gospels, is the multiplication of loaves and fishes, and it's always the same. They're out in the middle of nowhere. It's late. They don't know how they're going to feed the people. Jesus says, sit down. He multiplies the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. There's 5,000 men sitting down, and there's 12 baskets left over. Right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So it's unique in that it's and when you think about it, of all the miracles Jesus performs, to have only one in all 4 Gospels, written exactly the same way. Why am I bringing this up? In Matthew and Mark's Gospel, Jesus performs this miracle twice. So when you read it in Mark, we think Mark is written first. It's kind of weird because the first time it happens in chapter 6. Then like around chapter 8 or 9, I can never remember where the second one is, Jesus does it again. What's weird about it is, they're out in the middle of nowhere, and the disciples say, what are we going to do? Got all these people, we can't feed them. And you're thinking, wait a minute. 2 chapters ago, they just saw Jesus feed 5,000 people. I don't care how stupid you are, somebody would have to remember that. How can you forget that? So the way the second miracle story is written, it's bizarre. The apostles have no idea that Jesus can multiply loaves and fishes. Then when the miracle is over, all of a sudden they remember. So we think actually what happens there is Jesus only did it once. Mark doubles up on the miracle. First time Jesus does it, he does it with a Jewish audience. Second time he does it in front of a Gentile audience. Mark's gospel is written to Gentiles. Everybody understand what I'm saying? So Mark doubles up on the miracle to make sure the Gentiles know they're included in this with Jesus. So sometimes in the Gospels they do that. Same thing happens in the Abraham stories. There's a story where Abraham goes to Egypt and he's worried because his wife is so beautiful that the Pharaoh will kill him to marry her. Bear in mind, Abraham is 75. Sarah, I don't care how young she was when he married her, is not a spring chicken. So now the story kind of takes on, up until this point, the story is very realistic. Now all of a sudden the story takes on this bizarre turn that she's so beautiful, you know, and you begin to wonder, okay, what's going on here? That same story turns up later on in the story of Isaac. Has the same problem. So sometimes they took a good story and later on they just repeated it down the road again. Anyway, so there are definitely elements of fiction in the Abraham stories. Even though the character is historical, and even though there's no reason not to believe that the basic movement of the stories is accurate, right? There's still, you have to get it in your heads. No biblical author is ever trying to tell us exactly what happened. There's always a religious lesson behind the story. If they have to fudge the historical facts to get you to understand the religious point, they'll do it. Here's another example from the Gospels. Famous question Jesus asked, what's the greatest commandment? What is the greatest commandment? Jesus' answer is, love the Lord your God with your whole heart, taken from Deuteronomy 6, and your neighbor as yourself, which is taken from the book of Leviticus. Mark's Gospel, they ask Jesus the question, Jesus answers it. Matthew's Gospel, Jesus asks the question, Jesus answers it. Luke's Gospel, guy asks Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? Jesus turns around and says, what do you think? The guy gives the answer, not Jesus. So here's a situation where it looks like Luke actually takes words that were original to Jesus out of his mouth, puts them in the guy's mouth. Why does he do that? Jesus then says to the guy, you're correct. But then the guy turns around and asks this question, who is my neighbor? And then what follows, what parable follows? You probably can guess. Parable of the Good Samaritan. So Luke switches the words around, and Luke's the only one that has a parable of the Good Samaritan. This enables, he sets the parable of the Good Samaritan up by taking the words out of Jesus' mouth, having the guy ask, who is my neighbor? This allows Jesus or Luke to expand on who the idea of who your neighbor is. So Luke has more of a teaching there. Does this make sense to everybody? He expounds on loving your neighbor. What does that mean? Even your enemy, you have to help out. So they will, from time to time, turn things around that no doubt Jesus said. Another example, when Jesus comes into Jerusalem Palm Sunday, the famous stuff he does things in the temple is he throws the tables over, right? Does that in Mark, he does it in Matthew, does it in Luke. In John's Gospel, he flips the tables over not after Palm Sunday, but right after he's baptized. It's the same story. John moves the story. It really happened, there's no doubt. Because that incident is probably what got him arrested. Think about this. You're going into Jerusalem for a festival. Festivals last about 7 days. He flips the tables over like on the first day. So basically the priests have to be concerned. Is this guy's a troublemaker, right? And the soldiers in Antonium probably saw this happen too. So that put people on notice that Jesus might do something dramatic, and they're waiting for him to do something dramatic, and this is why they want to get him arrested. And why they want to arrest him away from where everybody else is. They can't arrest him in the temple area because the crowd's there and that might cause a riot. That's why they have to arrest him at night when there's nobody around, right? There's no doubt when he flips those tables over, in a sense, Jesus seals his fate when he flips the tables over. Because 4 days later, he's in jail, and a day after that, in less than 24 hours, he's dead. John has that incident way at the beginning of his gospel. Way at the beginning. In John's gospel, Jesus is arrested because he goes to Jerusalem after having raised Lazarus from the dead. And once he raises Lazarus from the dead, that scares the high priest. Oh, now the people are going to follow him. He raised Lazarus from the dead, so now he's a threat. So John replaces the temple flipping over with the raising Lazarus from the dead as the occasion for him being arrested. But meanwhile, by putting the tables flipped over at the beginning of the gospel, John sets up the idea that the Sadducees, the high priests, are against Jesus from the beginning. So you're not surprised every time he goes to Jerusalem in John's gospel, he has to be worried about being arrested. Am I making sense here? So they will take the facts. There's no doubt Jesus did flip the tables over. Everybody with me? But they will take factual information and move it to a different place in the gospel according to the religious point they want to make. Because the four gospel writers are writing to really four completely different audiences. There's no indication that the gospel writers were writing to the whole church. Right? In the beginning, the church was just, here's the church in Ephesus, here's the church in Jerusalem, right? There were separate churches. How much they had a sense of their universality, we don't even know.
Like Babel.
Yeah. So you had individual churches, and the Gospels appeared to have been written directly to specific audiences, with probably the four audiences had different needs. They didn't all have the same needs. That they all make, the Gospels all still make basically the same point. Jesus is both man and God. He dies to save us from our sins, right? Basic points are there, but they have to tailor the information so that that audience can understand it based on their situation. Does that make sense to everybody? So I tell the kids this all the time. Don't ever assume they're giving you, even if they do give you completely accurately historical information, there's a religious message in there. The religious message is always more important than exactly what happened, because, and this is the reason, us just doesn't make sense. So we think that if you tell me what happened, I can figure it out, right? But the evidence is, no. Right? Again, you look at the miracles of Jesus, how many people witnessed them, how many people actually believed he was the Messiah? Not that many. Seeing is not believing. So they know they have to put a spin on it to get you to understand the truth behind it. There's just no getting away from that. That, we would say, is what they're inspired to do. You don't need to be inspired to write down exactly what happened, you just need to be a good secretary. You need to be inspired to explain what's going on behind all this. Is everybody with me? And they basically, even in the Gospels, they're not lying. John says, we don't tell you everything Jesus said and did. We only tell you what you need to know in order to believe he's the Messiah, the Son of God, so you can have eternal life. They're basically saying, I'm giving you this information in this way so you can come to the correct understanding about who Jesus is. Because there's no point in just giving us straight facts. We could completely misinterpret the facts. How do they know that? A lot of people did misinterpret the facts. So they're not going to leave it up to their audience's own thinking. And they're honest about what they're doing. It's just that in the modern way we think, oh, just give me factual information, I can figure it out. Everybody understand? Okay. Kind of a digression there. But again, it's so hard for us, because we're just raised to think more scientifically and objectively, to think that people can express ideas in other ways. But they do it all the time in literature. Shakespeare did it in plays and poems, right? Somehow we always try to hold the Bible to a different standard. And that's a mistake. You gotta look at the kind of literature. So, again, to recap, there's no doubt first 11 chapters of Genesis are a series of myths. That doesn't mean they're completely made up. Obviously, there had to be a first set of parents, otherwise we wouldn't be here, right? Even if you follow the theory of evolution, there had to be a first. At some point, this one animal broke away from the rest of the animal world and got free will. Otherwise, it's hard to explain how we got here, right? There's no doubt that there were floods in the ancient Near East, right? That the Garden of Eden would be somewhere in the Fertile Crescent because that's where agriculture started. That there was the tower existed, right? Everybody hates snakes, that's why they say, well, if you look at it, right, there's a lot of realism behind these stories, but the stories are written really to try to explain in a symbolic way truths about life. So if I understand the first sequence, yes? Okay. So if you look at, again, to get from the Tower of Babel then to Abraham, how do you do that? Genealogy, right? It's the only way you can do it. It's the only way you can do it. So if we start, you see the record of the descendants of Shem, and then you get all the way down to the bottom, and you see verse 26 there. Terah was 70 years old. He became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So Abram, it's not Abraham yet, his name had changed, and Haran are brothers. Then you're going to get specifically into the record of Abraham. So the end of chapter 11 is a genealogy, and somebody want to read this verses 27 through 32 here? Go ahead.
Terah, this is the record of the descendants of Terah. Terah became the father of Abraham.
It's Abram.
Abram.
It becomes Abraham later on. God changes his name. Go ahead.
Nahor and
Haran.
Haran became the father of Lot.
And of course, Lot is going to be a character that you meet in some of the other Abraham stories. So this sets up where Lot is Abraham's nephew. So this sets all that up. Go ahead.
Haran died before his father Terah in his native land in Ur
of the Chaldeans. All right, bingo. This is Babylon. Ur is a city in Babylon. You can put your finger right there. This is where they're from. Right? There's no guesswork. This is it. And Ur happens to be the original city of Gilgamesh. This is the city, did I talk about this last time? It used to be on the Persian Gulf, literally, and now it's 10 or 20 miles inland. It's no longer on the water. Because, no, I talked about this at St. A's. What happens everywhere in the world where a river dumps into an ocean or a sea? What happens?
changes.
What gets formed? A delta. There's a Mississippi Delta, there's a Nile Delta, right? Has nothing to do with us. This is the natural progression because rivers carry silt downstream, right? And when the current hits the ocean or the sea, slows the current down, what does the silt do? It drops to the bottom, and if that happens enough, land is built up. So in the ancient world, there were cities that used to be on the water. They aren't, because here you have Ur would be where the Tigris and Euphrates came to get two rivers. So a delta is built up, and now the city literally is inland because the shore of the Persian Gulf moved. Does this make sense to everybody? So, go ahead.
Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was
Sarah, which is changed to Sarah later on. Go ahead.
And the name of Nahor's wife was Michal, daughter of Haran, the father of Michal and Issachar. Sarah was barren, she had no child.
Okay, so they're always going to tell you this for a reason. This isn't just an accidental reporting. A barren woman was considered in the Old Testament somebody who was probably under a curse. Because who gives the child? Not sex, but... So if God hasn't given you a child, he must have done something wrong. Now the barren mother motif is going to be all through the patriarchal stories, and it's going to continue. There's lots of famous characters in the Old Testament whose mother couldn't have children. Now we don't know That was always true, but the reason why they use this is to show that when the child is born, it has to be special. All the way up to John the Baptist, right? And that's why John the Baptist's father is punished. Right? Notice how the same angel comes to John and Mary. John's told, you're going to have a kid. And John goes, how can this happen? You know how people say there's such a thing as a stupid question? That was a stupid question. Because he's a priest. And what should he know? It happened, about a half a dozen or more times in the Old Testament. You should know that God can give a barren woman a child. You shouldn't have asked this question, boom, you're struck dumb. Because you asked a dumb question. Right? Now Mary, would you bear the child? And she says, well, I will, but I have never had sex. Now Mary's not punished because there is no precedent of a virgin having a child. But there's plenty of precedents of a barren woman having a child, starting with Sarah. So this is it's really a literary device that's used to highlight how special the child is. So Samson's mother, guess what, was barren. Samuel's mother was barren. Isaac's mother was barren. And Jacob and Esau's mother originally was barren. Jacob's wife, Rachel, was originally barren. Go figure. Right? And on and on and on and on to show that it's got to be highlighted. It's got to be the hand of God. This got to be it's a way of showing this is a special person. Whether they were all really barren or not, we don't know. It becomes useful to write it this way to show the person is unique and special and is going to have a special role. John the Baptist is going to have a special role because he's going to be the one to kind of prepare the way for Jesus. So they do use these ideas over and over again. All right, so you're told she's barren for a reason. It's going to set up a problem. Go ahead and finish this up.
Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarah, the wife of his son Abram, and brought them out of of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan.
So the original move was by Abram's father, taking them from all the way over on the eastern side of the Fertile Crescent. Now they're going through the Fertile Crescent. They can't go across to Canaan, all the way through the Fertile Crescent, and they're going to stop. Go ahead, read the next thing.
But when they reached Haran, they settled there.
Haran is way up in northern Syria, which is north of Israel. So you're still up in Mesopotamia, more or less, kind of almost to Turkey. Go ahead.
Let's see. The lifetime of Terah was 205 years. Then Terah died in Haran.
Okay. So this sets up the call of Abraham, specifically. Everybody with me? So we know we're now looking at historical characters. We can find all the places on the map, not a problem. So the next 3 verses are really important, because the next 3 verses set up what is God's purpose in calling Abraham ultimately. So let me read verses 1 through 3 of chapter 12.
The Lord said to Abram, go forth from your land, your relatives, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you.
So basically, Abraham is now going to move due south. He's already up above Israel, right? He's going to start moving due south. Go ahead.
I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. All the families of the earth will find blessing in you.
Okay, the last thing you read is really important. God is not calling Abraham just to bless him. Everybody see this? God is calling Abraham so that eventually all nations may be blessed. So it's God is pulling mankind back to himself. He has to start somewhere. So he starts with Abraham. From Abraham, you get to Moses, the chosen people. The chosen people are chosen not just to be the only people chosen, right? But to be eventually the messengers so that all mankind may be saved. The original promise is universal. Everybody see this? From the start, it's universal. So God's calling Abraham, and that's going to reverse everything that's happened in the first 11 chapters. Because on our own, we just can't help ourselves. We need help. So we have to rely on God to help us.
It's kind of like the first real positive thing.
You're right. That's a good way of putting it. The first 11 chapters start off real positive and then they get really negative. Now this introduces, now why should we believe that God can do this? Because of chapter 1. Because he created everything to be good, and now he's going to try to help us get things back the way they were supposed to be. So if you don't have chapter 1 and the belief that God created everything to be good, then what's the point of hoping that things can get better? If everything's always been totally screwed up, why would we believe things can get better? So that first story, everybody understand why that first story is critical now? Belief, positive belief about things are meant to be better is really, and even from a psychological point of view, we will not work to improve our lives unless we think we have some control over making our lives better. Right? That's the problem with making people into a victim. Even if they are a victim. Once they're convinced they're a victim, then psychology is, I can't do anything to help myself because my problems are all caused by the outside. Right? That's the problem with, like currently in politics, the whole concept of institutional racism convinces people that you can't help yourself because the system is against you. Well, once you convince people of that, then they have a very negative way of looking at things because, hey, I can't help myself. So what do we need to do? We need to destroy the system. It's not I need to improve myself because I can't improve myself because I don't have a chance of improving myself because I'm not in any way causing my problems, it's the system that's causing my problems. So you take the motivation away psychologically and spiritually from people, they become victims, and then people wonder why they're unhappy. They're unhappy because you have no hope, because you're convinced, I can't help myself. I'm not saying people aren't victims, everybody understand? If you ever go to a psychologist or a therapist, really when you think of it, their main job is to do what? Stop worrying about the past, it's over. Don't ruminate about the future. What can you do now to improve your life? Gee, who said this 2,000 years ago? Right? Don't worry about tomorrow. Today has troubles enough of its own. Sermon on the Mount, right? Jesus was actually in some ways a master psychologist. Hit the nail right on the head. Go figure. 2,000 years later, we're just figuring out he was right about this stuff. It's amazing. So, anyway, the concept that you have to have a positive outlook in order to work to improve things. Otherwise, you're just tearing stuff down and you never get anywhere. Does this make sense? From a spiritual point? And this is why, if you look at the people that are religious, that practice their religion, that go to church every Sunday, right, that do work and stuff, tend to be people who live longer, are healthier, and have better lives. Like my mom lived to be 100 years old. She volunteered 3 days a week. I'm sure, and went to church, mass every week. Kevin brought her to mass, right? That was a big reason why she lived so long. You have a purpose. So again, this is reintroduce the idea we have a purpose, but we have to listen to God in order to achieve that purpose. We can't do it on our own. Goes back to what you were asking. The guys building the tower just doing it on their own. Right? We can't do it on our own. Okay, is this making sense? Spiritually, psychologically, how it all pulls together. It's amazing how these guys knew what they were doing when they wrote this. Okay. Verse 4, you're given another interesting piece of information here.
Woman,
Somebody read 4 through 9.
Abram went as the Lord directed him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran.
Okay, why are you being told that Abraham is, you've been told two critical things. Sarah's barren, Abraham's 75. Now how do they know Sarah's barren? The only way to know she's barren is, obviously they were having sex and she couldn't get pregnant.
Yeah.
He's 75 years old, what does that mean? How many 75-year-old men have kids? Not too many. What's God gonna promise Abraham? A son. Does the promise look shaky from the start here? Everybody understand? This is a soap opera. Everybody knows what a soap opera is, right? The Abraham stories are set up like a soap opera. Every episode ends, God's made this promise, and wait a minute. The more episodes you get into the soap opera, the worse it looks for the promise being able to be fulfilled, because Abraham's only going to get older and older and older. Sarah's still barren. God keeps making these promises. It ain't happening. And then when it finally happens, beyond all belief, what does God say to Abraham? Kill the kid. Does that make any sense? It doesn't make any sense, and it's not supposed to. It's not supposed to make sense. Because what's he doing to Abraham? He's putting him in a position where he can't think what is the right thing to do here. Killing the kid makes it look like you're breaking God's own promise for him. Doesn't make sense to kill a kid, because now he's 100 years old. Not killing the kid doesn't make sense, because every time Abraham does what God tells him to do, things turn out okay. So you're between a rock and a hard place. You're damned if you do. If I kill him, that looks stupid. If I don't kill him, that looks stupid. So this is why Abraham is considered the father of our faith. There's no way to mentally figure this out. You have to make a decision on blind faith. I don't know how it's going to work out. I have to trust that it will work out. Because and think about this, even when we don't want to do something, we're told you should do this, right? You should eat your fruits and vegetables. I don't like fruits and vegetables. Well, Kathy comes along and says, yeah, but I can show you where, diet-wise, eating fruits and vegetables is really good for you. So now we might say, okay, maybe I should, because you've given me a good reason to do it, right? Abraham isn't given a reason to kill the kid. We don't mind doing things when we can figure out why we should, right? Even if we don't want to do it, I can say, okay, but in the long run, this is going to be good for me. But there's no way you can figure out in the long run how this is going to be good for Abraham if he kills the kid. Everybody with me?
Most of us think, what does Isaac think about this?
Well, yeah, that's not in there.
No.
And also back then, it didn't matter what Isaac thought. In the ancient world, even up through including Roman times, children had no rights. I mean, in the Roman Empire, if a Roman father wanted his wife to abandon a baby after he was born, she said, put the baby on the doorstep, we're not taking care of it. Or have an abortion. That was it. Parents had total control over the life of their children. There was no child, what do we have now in the government?
Social workers.
There were no social workers. Nobody told you, no, you can't spank your child, you can't do this. None of that existed. You had absolute authority. When Jesus says you have to become like a little child, he doesn't mean innocent. Children were totally dependent on their parents. So to become like a little child means you have to be totally dependent on God. That's what he means, right? It's total dependency, which is hard for us to do because we don't want to give up our autonomy. Anyway, so when you're given these details, this is not an accident you're told he's 75. It's not an accident you're told Sarah's barren. Before the story even gets started, the promise hasn't even been made, right? Basically, it's been made in a kind of a vague way, but you're told it's to build up the tension that how can God do this since it's usually beyond a 75-year-old man's ability to have a kid. Let's read the first story and then we'll stop, because we're going over time here. So he's 75 years old, so what do they do? Who was reading?
Abram took his wife Sarai, his brother's son Lot, all the possessions that they had accumulated, and all the persons they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land as far as the sacred place of
Shechem, which is there. You can find it on the map.
by
Right.
by the Oak of Morah. The Canaanites were then in the land.
Okay, notice how that's a little aside there. Because what's God going to do?
They would defeat the
It's a
Canaanites.
twofold promise, right? I'm going to make you a great family. I'm going to give you Canaan. You got two problems. He's old, and land's already occupied. Right? So what they do is they're putting impediments in the story, right? Here are the impediments. It's going to make it look like can God really do this? Right? There's two impediments. Go ahead.
The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land.
So everybody understand why you're told the Canaanites are living there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because it makes it look like, okay, how can God possibly get the land since there are already people living there? Go ahead.
So Abram built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country east of Bethel.
Okay, Bethel's a real place. It's down just north of Jerusalem. And it is the beginning of the hill country. He's going due south, right through the middle of Canaan, which is the route a caravan would take. So that not only can you name the places, but we know the route he's taken actually makes sense based on how people traveled back then. You're definitely looking at a historical story here. Go ahead.
Okay, he pitched his tent with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east.
And those two towns are close together. Ai is the second town that Joshua is going to capture when they re-enter the promised land. Go ahead.
He built an altar there to the Lord and invoked the Lord by name. Then Abram journeyed on by stages to the Negev.
The Negev is the bottom of Israel. That's a desert. So you get to the point where you get down to the bottom and you're in the desert and you start to get into the Sinai Peninsula. So again, if you were to be looking at a map and following this, you could see he's just walking right down through the middle, perfectly logical. All these places exist. Everything that's described is real. You're definitely not looking at mythology. Does this make sense? You transition to what you would call more legendary material. All right, now, you guys want to finish this out or do you want to go? You have to go? Okay. Well, I'll recap it next week so you're, no. What's going to happen is, okay, there's a series, if you look at this, there's going to be a series of stories about Abraham. So that's the other thing that's different about once you get to Genesis 12, you're going to have a series of stories about the same guy. Genesis 1 through 11, there's a series of stories, but it's never about the same guy, right? So all of a sudden, you're not only geographically, you know where you are, it's all about the same person. So everything switches here. The series, each story has a kind of a built-in structure to it that you don't really notice at first till you read enough of the story. Now, it's not always there completely, but here's the structure. God tells Abraham, do this. Abraham does it. Something happens that's not Abraham's fault, that causes him a problem. In this case, there's going to be a famine in the land. Abraham can't stay in southern Canaan. He's got to move to Egypt. Now, we know historically this is a fact. When there was a famine in southern Canaan, the southern Canaanites would go to northern Egypt for food because that's the Delta region in Egypt. The Delta region hardly ever had a famine because it's very green, because that's where the Nile fans out, right? It's very rich. The richest soil probably in Egypt is there. So we know from Egyptian records, they had border problems. Does this sound familiar? Border problems? The Egyptians would have to station troops on the border when there was a famine in Canaan, because you would have groups of people coming in to get food. They would start coming in and get food, and then get out. They didn't want the Canaanites coming in and settling and taking over the northern part of Egypt. So our southern border, right, is nothing new. They had problems. We know for a fact from Egyptian records that this happened periodically. So this story fits Egyptian history. Everybody with me? Again, not only do the places fit, but the situations. A famine in an area, whole populations would get up and move and have to get food from somewhere else. And everybody knew the Nile region, the Delta region in Egypt is the closest place to get food if you're in southern Canaan. Abraham does a logical thing here. He moves to Egypt. Not his fault. Everybody understand? So Abraham follows what God tells him to do. Something happens, gets in the way of the promise. Abraham has to move, and he gets into a pickle. In this case, the pickle is his wife is so beautiful. Now we get into some fiction, right? He's 75. Even if Sarah is 15 years younger than him, she's still not a spring chicken, right? And even though my wife at 68 is still beautiful, I don't think Sarah was. Anyway, so Abraham becomes afraid. If he goes in with Sarah, the Egyptians will kill him so she can marry Pharaoh. So he passes Sarah off as his sister. And what happens? She marries Pharaoh anyway. Pharaoh gives Abraham all kinds of gifts, including things that didn't exist back then, like camels. You know, the camel wasn't domesticated yet. So this tells us the story was written later, after the camel was domesticated. Sheep and donkeys and stuff like that. Abraham gets all this stuff, but what's the problem? Now he's in Egypt, he's not in Canaan, and how's he going to have a son if his wife is married to Pharaoh? So Abraham has, in trying to solve a problem, he's put himself in a pickle. Who's going to come in and rescue him?
God.
What does God do? He causes a famine. He causes plagues to hit Egypt. Does that sound familiar? Plagues? That's what's going to happen later on. Pharaoh goes, oh, I must have done something wrong, or God is mad at me, finds out that Sarah was Abraham's wife, says, hey, why'd you pass her off as your sister? Now you got me in a lot of trouble. You guys need to get out of here. So the cycle goes like this. God tells Abraham to do this. Abraham does it. Something happens that gets in the way of the fulfillment of the promise. Abraham then tries to solve the problem on his own, makes the situation worse. God steps in and pulls his butt out of the fire. That pattern is in almost every Abraham story. What does that tell us? The author of the stories deliberately putting the pattern there because he wants to make the point, on our own, we mess things up. You gotta trust in God, right? So by the time you get to the end, and he finally has the kid, you're going, okay, it's all over. Then the very next story is, wham, who killed JR? Remember?
Yeah.
Okay? So that's how this is written. You get to the end, and it's kill your kid. And then you have to wait until the fall to find out who killed JR. Everybody knows what I'm talking about, who killed JR, right? See, if you use this reference to the high school kids, they go, what? Who killed JR? So it's obvious that the stories were written like a soap opera, right? You get to the end, what's going to happen? You got to tune in. The next episode, same thing, just a different. The story's different, but the pattern is exactly the same. So it's a series of stories set up till Abraham gets to be 100. Sarah can't have a kid because she's not having her period anymore. It's now totally impossible. She has a kid, and boom. Everybody? Okay? So it's a good idea to kind of read some of these stories. So read chapter 13 and chapter 15. 15 is a weird story, but it'll make sense after I explain it to you. Yeah, read 13, you can skip 14, 13, 15, and 16, which is the birth of Ishmael. for next week, okay? Any questions? Yeah.
I just keep wondering about, the woman who maybe was not being barren. It seems like that might have been.
The woman maybe what?
When you're saying that maybe being barren was.
Well, being barren was considered a curse.
Right.
Because you must have done something wrong, or God, like, if you read the story about John the Baptist, here, go to Luke.
Well, what I wanted to say is, I've always thought that it would make things easier to believe about Mary being a virgin if you knew that these other people had come from barren women.
Right.
It would be a less of a jump for you.
Well, the other thing is, that's interesting is, when Luke does this, Luke is the only one that parallels the birth of John the Baptist and the birth of Jesus. And what he does is he tries to show how great John the Baptist is, but it doesn't matter how great John is, Jesus is that much greater. Because here's a problem that existed in the early church. There were people who saw John the Baptist as a more important figure than Jesus. After all, John the Baptist was martyred by Herod. There's no doubt he was killed, right? He was seen as a great prophet. So John the Baptist had a big following among the Jews. Josephus writes a lot about John the Baptist. He was considered it was a highly regarded prophetic figure. And there was competition, after both are dead, there was competition between the followers of Jesus and the followers of John the Baptist. Some thought, well, John is more important than Jesus because A, who baptized whom? John baptizing Jesus could make it look like John was greater. Jesus himself with his apostles, appeared to be a kind of a baptizer after he was baptized by John. Some people thought that Jesus was therefore the disciple of John. And John was not just a precursor to Jesus. So the early church had to wrestle with that problem. The gospel writers are like walking on eggs there, because they don't want to build Jesus up by disrespecting John. So in Luke's gospel, he tries to show you how, here's the birth of John, it was miraculous, but the birth of Jesus was even more miraculous. Does that make sense? John's given a great job, but Jesus is going to be given a greater job. So he parallels their story. And Luke is the only one that has John and Jesus being related. The other three don't even mention that idea. So we don't even know if they were related. It's just in the one gospel, and it seems like Luke has done this to try to show respect to John, but greater respect to Jesus. All the gospel writers have to do this. They do it in a different way. In John's gospel, John the Baptist recognizes Jesus at the baptism, there's the Lamb of God. In John's gospel, there's a baptism scene, but Jesus is never baptized. So John kind of eliminates the problem, because Jesus was never really baptized by John in John's gospel. Therefore, he can't be a sinner, and he can't be John's disciple. And John himself is the one who sees the Holy Spirit coming down on Jesus. Does this make sense? Matthew's gospel is the only one that has the dialogue, I shouldn't be baptizing you, you should be baptizing me. It's the only one that has the dialogue. If that dialogue existed, why don't the other guys have it? But what's Matthew do? By having that dialogue, Matthew shows John's acknowledging Jesus is greater than me, and Jesus gives permission to John to baptize him, making it look like Jesus is greater than John. Does this make sense? So they all have to deal with this problem, because the baptism of Jesus creates two problems. One, everybody knows the early church taught that Jesus was without sin. But John the baptizer was baptizing for what purpose? Forgiveness of sin. So it makes it look like, was Jesus a sinner? That's problem number one. Problem number two, John is first on the scene. That's why Luke has him born first. Even though he's first, he's not the best. So the early church had to deal with those two problems, but they had to deal with it in a way that didn't disrespect John. So they couldn't build Jesus up by knocking John down. In other words, that's not how it would be handled today, right? Everybody bashes each other. But back then it was, can't do it that way. And they all have a different way of doing it. It's interesting.
Later on, Jesus himself will say that John was the greatest born from.
Yeah, you have some very interesting quotes later on
Yes.
about Jesus. And then you have the weird quote in Matthew and Luke where John, after he's arrested, sends a message back, are you the one who is to come, or should we wait for another? So in Matthew's gospel, he seems to know who Jesus is initially, and then later on, he seems to be unsure. So our problem with John the Baptist from a scripture point of view is, we know that John knew somebody was coming after him. That's obvious. That he wasn't the greatest. John says this in all four gospels. Did he know exactly who Jesus was is an interesting question, because the evidence in the gospels is mixed. What was his understanding of Jesus? Exactly. We don't really know. That doesn't mean John didn't prepare the way for Jesus. He did. But what was John's understanding is not really sure, because you have that quote in Matthew and Luke. Are you the one who is to come, or should we wait for another?
Isn't Elizabeth's deference to Mary proof that?
But that is only in, the good point, it's only in Luke's gospel. Luke is the only one that mentions John and Jesus being related. When you have a story in one gospel, it's not in the other three, Ed, the question you have to ask yourself is, how historical is it? If it's in all four, the baptism of Jesus is all four gospels, right? There's no doubt Jesus was baptized. When you have a story that's only in one gospel, the biblical scholars look at it and say, is this historical, or is it there for another reason? Now, I would agree with you. Luke has it in there because Mary walks in the room. What happens? The child leaps in Elizabeth's womb, caused by who? The Holy Spirit. Elizabeth acknowledges, but that's Luke's way of showing, again, how great John is, but he's not as great as Jesus. Does that make sense? So, yeah, when you have an incident or a story that's only in one, the way biblical scholars look at the Gospels today is there's four criteria for determining whether it's historic. One is, how many times do you find it? The miracle of loaves and fishes, it's in all four Gospels. Right? Other criteria is, how embarrassing is it? The baptism is embarrassing because it could make Jesus look like a sinner. So there's no doubt Jesus was baptized, and there's no doubt he started his mission after his baptism. That's historical fact. You can bet your life on that. Does that make sense? When you see Peter's denial, it's in all four Gospels. How embarrassing is that? He's the leader of the early church later on, right? Why would you make a story up, make him look so bad unless it really happened? Peter probably really did deny Jesus. No, everybody's got it. It looks bad. Women going to the tomb for the resurrection. No, wait a minute. Women going to the tomb and finding the tomb empty is embarrassing. Where were the apostles? And when the women go to the tomb and they find it empty, they don't assume Jesus is raised from the dead. They have to be told he's raised. How embarrassing is that? Having women as the primary witnesses is embarrassing in and of itself, because back then women were not considered good witnesses. So if you're going to make up a story about the resurrection, the last thing you would do is have women be the first witnesses. And everybody's confused. If you read the resurrection stories, even though Jesus seems to clearly predict he's going to be raised from the dead, nobody went to the tomb expecting the tomb to be empty. They're shocked when they get there and the tomb is empty. And these are his closest followers. Right? So the resurrection appears to have been a total shock to them. They didn't seem to be expecting it that way. Because all four Gospels write the story the same way. And you might say, well, of course, but no. If you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'll find they disagree in a lot of places. So when they agree all at the same thing, you got to pay attention.
Okay, I'm gonna, the reason I think Luke's gospel is different in many, many ways is Luke himself did not know Jesus. He was not an apostle.
Neither did Mark. Mark wasn't an apostle either.
Yeah, but
Well, yeah.
Well, I've heard, well, there's always been a thing that Luke interviewed.
Yeah, well, that's what it says at the beginning of the gospel. He interviewed people to write the gospel.
He interviewed the Blessed Mother. And all
That's
those-
tradition.
That's tradition.
But that's not in the
Those things
scripture.
That she held in her heart.
Yeah.
She revealed
Yeah.
to Luke.
But he actually
I
doesn't tell
know
us
there's no
that.
truth to that, but.
Yeah, well, there may be truth to it. What I'm saying is, I'm being conservative.
Yeah.
We're going by what's in the Bible. Luke tells us he's not an eyewitness. He's very honest about that. Mark wasn't an eyewitness either. There is that reference to the fact that he knew Peter, right? But we don't know. It's just a reference. We don't really know how well he knew Peter. The Gospels are different because they're written to different audiences. He was not writing to the same audience that Mark was, or John. And Luke appears to be most probably not Jewish. We think Luke was a Gentile, but the other three were definitely Jewish. So he not only was different, writing to different audiences, he's writing from a different perspective, and he was the best writer.
He was probably the most educated.
Yeah, he was. He was the best writer. He wrote 2 works. His Greek is really good. He writes like a Greek historian, so.
And that genealogy he does is in the beginning of his,
It's backwards.
it's backwards.
Luke's genealogy is
Or maybe
between,
it's one.
is right after Jesus has gone into the desert before he's tempted. That's where Luke's genealogy. Matthew's genealogy is at the beginning. Matthew's is a traditional Jewish genealogy. It goes from Abraham to Jesus. Luke starts at Jesus and goes backward to Adam. Goes back, and the names don't line up. So the genealogies themselves are just, again, they're a way of transitioning you to. So Luke has Jesus traced back to Adam, which obviously Jesus has to be traced back to Adam. Why does he do that? What's going to happen to Jesus next? He's going to be tempted in the desert by the devil. Who was tempted by the devil first? Adam. So what Luke is trying to show is that Jesus overcomes the sins of mankind, whereas Adam couldn't overcome the temptations. By putting his genealogy where he does and bringing it to Adam, it automatically reminds you Jesus is here to save all mankind. Whereas Matthew's focus is narrower. Jesus is definitely Jewish. He only goes back to Abraham. He doesn't go all the way back to Adam. Abraham, David, right? So Matthew's genealogy focuses on the Jewishness of Jesus, because Matthew's writing to an audience that is basically Jewish, Christian, and Luke is writing to a basically Gentile audience, which everybody traces their roots back to Adam.
Would they? Do you think at that time people would know about?
No, but from their perspective, from the Jewish perspective, yeah. There had to be a first. Not everybody believed the Adam and Eve story, no.
Yeah, because they wouldn't even have known.
But Luke is trying to show that Jesus is the universal Savior by going to Adam. Does that make sense? Okay, we gotta go. I keep going longer. Which I don't mind, but I don't really know people hang people up here. Well, because in 1947, the world got together and decided, hey, we're going to create a. There was no Jewish state in 1947. So if you move the Jews in, create a country, you got to take the land away from somebody else. So that's why there's that.
They're Jewish people.
I mean, basically, the Romans kicked the Jews out of Jerusalem in 135 AD.
Take slow steps.
Because the Jews revolted against the Romans in 66 AD, and then they revolted against it in 135. And that's when they kicked the Jews out of Jerusalem. So basically, the Jews lost their homeland about 135 years after Jesus died, and they were wandering around. And to give the Jews back a homeland, countries got together and said, we're going to create a land here with the Palestinians. Meanwhile, people have been living there for hundreds of years. They got moved out, so there's hard feelings.
Did you show her the paper for 40 days? Oh, God. I
It
forgot.
was 70, and then in 135, they revolted again.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, and this time, the Romans got fed up, and basically kicked most of the Jews out of the city.
Yeah. They dispersed.
You're right, they were sacked. What happened in 135 was the Roman emperor, remember they destroyed the temple, and around 135, the Roman emperor at the time was thinking about rebuilding a temple, but it would have been a pagan temple, and that started a second revolt. And the Romans moved in this time and just, they even changed the name of the city from Jerusalem at the time. Yeah, it's interesting history.
Okay.
Alright, let me get that set. See you all next week? Yeah. If we don't live in Puerto Rico, we get 30 inches of rain.
I know. that
Wow.
It's still raining on those poor people.
Wow. 30 inches, that's,
Yeah.
and they have all those hills and stuff, so when it rains in the hills, yeah, and the water all goes down on everybody else. Oh, you're welcome.